much. So please accept my apologies, and I have prepared, so that's a good thing. So it's one of those things that happens, isn't it? And thank you for having me here. And I'm just going to share my screen so I can show you some slides. Sean's obviously introduced me, which is great, so I can get straight into it. So hopefully you can see the slides, everybody. Good. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. Obviously, I'm going to talk a little bit about working with psychosis and voices, and I'm sort of framing that in the language of a dissociotic framework, which I'll explain to you. And this is a model that I've developed, I suppose primarily because I was dissatisfied with not only the way we use diagnosis, but the language we use around diagnosis, particularly when connecting with people who are said to be in a psychotic experience. So one night I was really fed up and I decided to make up a new theory, and that's where this model has come from. But it incorporates various other theories as well, which I'll explain. So before I go any further, I just want to acknowledge I'm meeting on the land of the Kaurna people here in Adelaide Plains region, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And this is where the Humane Clinic is based, and where we operate from. So I acknowledge all traditional owners around the world, really. And I think that most of what I'm saying, if not all of what I'm saying, is not new. It's come before us, certainly. So just to give you a sort of bit of background, if you think about the model I'm going to talk about, this sort of alternative to working with what we call psychosis, we might think about the medical model and how we've come up with diagnostic language, diagnostic labels, and it requires a professional to take control, to be in charge, to know the answers, or hopefully know the answers for people. But what we would say is that we very quickly move to risk, and from risk we very quickly move to seeing not the person, but seeing diagnosis and risk only. So the person ceases to be the person we see. We've moved to a trauma-informed model, and I think there's many benefits of the trauma-informed model, but if we're not careful, we talk very simply about the neurobiology of trauma and the stress responses, and of course people can then become the trauma rather than becoming who they are. So we then think about the risks in that, and the person becomes the risk and trauma. So what we're saying and where we're coming from is, how do we create mutuality? Whether you're a worker, whether you're a family member, whether you're an individual experiencing distress and problems in this way, well, we can come with love, and love is a word that's not used enough in mental health in our view, and we're talking really about mutuality then. So I could be the person helping, or I could be the person in distress, and they aren't two different people essentially. And this brings us into what I want to talk about, which is that what we call psychosis and the voices that we might hear are actually just common and understandable human experiences. So some people, I would say, might feel great anxieties and physiological experiences. Others might hear voices or see visions or have very difficult thought processes that cause them distress. And I suppose our working is saying, well, actually all of us know the experience of distress and vulnerability. So we can think about that rather than thinking about coming up with answers for what that vulnerability might be called. So in that regard, it's a lot about perception. So psychosis, we could think about, is always in perception. And if you look on the right-hand side, you'll see the vase and the face. And this is only important because the PhD around this talked about how the brain can't hold two images at the same time. So we flick between one and the other whilst we're trying to hold them together. And so the dissociotic model and the work I talk about in psychosis is about saying, well, actually, it's our perception that someone is different to us, that they're biologically different to us. But if we spend enough time in relationship with them, we'll realize that they're talking about the experiences in their life rather than necessarily a biological condition. And I the physiology of schizophrenia, but I suppose I would argue that that hasn't really ever been proved. I also want to acknowledge that a lot of the work that we do is sort of informed by Aboriginal understanding from Australia and cultural understanding across the world. And certainly when I talk to my peers in Australia who are First People, there seems to be quite a common story that, yeah, what you're talking about, Matt, is what we've known for 60,000 years. So you might talk about it in white fellas language, but it's perhaps not that new to our people. So I want to acknowledge that that's informed this work. Then we can understand, and this is just really giving you quite a quick tour through our work, really, but we can understand the perception is that people have a biological condition called schizophrenia. They hear voices within that condition. On Reed, some of you would know in New Zealand, certainly, and around the world. And he talks about this just to show you this perceptual difference. On the left, the early effects of trauma on developing brain, overactivity of the HPA axis, neurotransmitter abnormalities, hippocampal damage, cerebral atrophy, and reversed cerebral asymmetry. I don't want to get into describing all those. But if we then look at the evidence that schizophrenia is a brain disease, well, those 5 things are also true in that. So we can flick between the two and see that there's a distinct commonality between what we call schizophrenia brain and what we call traumatized child's brain. So really, really important for us to kind of, when we're looking at something and we're kind of trying to make sense of someone's experience, trying to understand the perceptual difficulties we might have about allowing that person to tell their story as it is for them. And I suppose this book, Trauma and Madness in Mental Health Services by Dr. Noelle Hunter, this was her PhD, she's a New York psychologist. And I just wanted to include this, you don't need to read the whole thing, but I'm happy to share the slides later, of course. But what she summed up was that she doesn't believe psychosis and dissociation are necessarily they are separate things, but they both exist at once. But what she sums it up with is that whether someone sees psychosis as a biological condition or a dissociative response to adversity, often the difference simply boils down to who can frame things the way the professional wants to hear or agrees with. And that's not a good basis for treatment, having to present yourself in the way that the professional in the front of you sees it, as opposed to somebody else seeing it. And of course, the knock-on, and I'm a nurse practitioner, so I count myself in those professionals. The knock-on, of course, is that our society gets its narratives around distress and psychosis from what the professionals say and believe. Again, then, if we're going to move into how we see things in the perceptual stuff, we need to think about the impact of if we see someone as having a biological disease versus a reaction to their psycho-environmental conditions. And Pavon and Vase talks about the degree to which health professionals engage in dehumanization depends critically on the professional's conceptualization of schizophrenia, namely biogenetic or psycho-environmental. And what they were saying here is that if we see someone as fundamentally different to us, it's easier to do things to people rather than be with people. And very much the model that we're working with at Humane Clinic is about being with people in the process of them moving through their experience, rather than us having to do things to them to change it. And I'll expand on that shortly. I'll jump over a few bits. So thinking about hearing voices, for many of us, this is quite well-known knowledge now, really, I suppose. But just thinking about how many people hear voices, is it a common experience? Does it fit into the sort of narrow band of schizophrenia, perhaps a bit of bipolar numbers in our societies? And it clearly doesn't. The Hearing Voices movement around the world, set up by Professor Marius Rom and the late Dr. Sondra Escher, have demonstrated all sorts of deep understandings. And here's just a few. In 1894, there was an amazing study that showed us about 10% of people heard voices. And if you adjust that for sleep related, it was about 7%. And when the Hearing Voices movement began again, began in the 90s, early 90s, someone did a very similar study with about 18,000 people. And again, around 10% of the community would hear voices. Of course, it's dependent on how we describe the process of hearing voices. Maybe some noises, maybe constant talking, maybe they're inside our head, maybe they're outside our head. But that was the sort of broad data. And when the hearing voices model sort of first started coming together in 2007-8, the research that was published said about 70% of clinical population of voice hearers who experience distress would identify having trauma in their life. And I just think that the 94% one's really interesting. When people do the hearing voices interview, which is the longitudinal interview of the journey of voice hearing, about 94% of voice hearers are able to link their voices with emotional or social conflict in their life. So I think it's really important data to realize that given the right support, people who hear voices can make quite a lot of sense of why they're hearing voices and where they think they come from. Which of course is beneficial, that it doesn't necessarily take the voices away, but nor does a lot of psychiatric treatment, but it allows people to change their relationship with the experience of voice hearing and then function well in life. And I suppose the easiest and best way to demonstrate that as a human is to say that I heard voices for 4 years while I was a patient in the psychiatric system and put on various medications, given ECT, lived in a therapeutic community, 5 prolonged admissions, and I stopped hearing voices as I came off my medication under the supervision of a very wonderful psychiatrist. You know what, Matt, I'm going to start taking you off these drugs. They don't work for you. Which was a very blunt statement, but it was also very empowering to kind of realize that someone was that engaged in the relationship outside of their education and their position to kind of say, well, we're doing more harm than good right now, so let's have another think. And I went into psychotherapy. Anyway, I didn't hear voices for about 17 years after that, or 18 years after that. And then
I've got my fingers crossed he's going to come back. Please bear with us.
always hear them at different times in your life.
Hey, Matt, we missed a whole heap of that, unfortunately. You keep going in and out.
Ah, sorry, I'm on a Wi-Fi hotspot. Sorry,
Matt. Where we lost you was when you started telling us about when the voices came back again. So if you wouldn't mind telling us that would be great. Thank you.
Good, thank you. This is good. You're a nice group of people. Thank you. So yeah, in 2017 and 18, I mean, maybe I'll tell you a little bit more then. The Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Sexual Abuse reported its interim report in 2017 in Australia. And it was a very strange day for me. I'd been in the mental health system doing hearing voices work, rolled it out as a model of care in South Australia, but there was quite a lot of opposition from some of the more traditional purveyors of mental health services, is a polite way of saying it. And that morning I was in Sydney doing some training, and I got an email saying I'd been awarded Australian Mental Health Nurse of the Year, but I wasn't to tell anyone. And I thought, oh, everyone's going to be off my back. I've finally kind of got acknowledged that this is legitimate work. That afternoon, I listened to the radio and I listened to the interim reports from the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Sexual Abuse. And I had the most surreal experience as a survivor of sexual abuse in the church myself. I listened to this radio report and I had the most, I suppose we would say, delusional, psychotic thinking, where I thought this person on the radio was telling my family in England that I'd been abused in the church, because I'd never told anyone. So I was 40 at the time and I was abused when I was 6 and 7 and I'd just never told anyone. And so I had this moment where everything had been going on really well, and in the morning it looked like everything was perfect, and in the afternoon this gross shock happened to me. And from that point on I started hearing a voice again for a period of time. So I think it's for me, it feels like, oh, well, okay, probably my response to acute distress and confusion is that I'm going to hear voices, which feels all right to me because I'm not worried about it anymore. So again, just looking at the prevalence then in more modern times, if we think about auditory verbal hallucinations, as voices are often referred to in the literature, the prevalence of them in society is significantly more than we would know. But again, we don't actually know in the current era. So that study Tien said about 7 or 10% heard voices. Vanessa Bevan, one of our wonderful Kiwi psychologist friends who was in Australia at the time, demonstrated it was about 15% of the community. And then Leedsmith and Barkhouse showed us it was somewhere between 5 and 25% of people in society would identify hearing voices, which shows you we just don't really know more than anything. But it certainly shows you there's a commonality of it in our society, rather than it being a very distinct abstract reality for a few people. And just the bottom there on the slide, it's talking about the prevalence of schizophrenia. It doesn't bear any correlation to the amount of people who hear voices. So we know as well that voice hearing is way beyond schizophrenia or classic diagnosis. What we know then about the sort of trauma in people's life, the adversity in people's life, and the relationship between that and psychosis or voices then is that the hearing voices movement summed it up really, that voices are more prevalent in the general population than was previously believed. I think we know that. It's more likely a personal reaction to life stress whose meaning or purpose can be deciphered, and it's best considered a dissociative experience. So I wouldn't really share a distinction between different psychotic phenomena and voices. I know the literature, the traditional literature says there's different things and has different hypotheses as to why. But I, in my work over the last 20 years, I would say that there is phenomenological difference in people's experiences, but we can't really match up who will experience what and why and what it relates particularly to. So I don't know if I put a slide in. Oh, yes, good. So thinking then about voices, or particularly voices, but other realities in different diagnostic models, well, it's transdiagnostic. So if you spend time and you intentionally ask people you're spending time with if they hear voices in the BPD label, the bipolar label, the depressive label, the eating disorder label, the schizophrenia label, the obsessive compulsive disorder labels, many of these people would identify a phenomena that I would say is, broadly speaking, similar to voice hearing in any psychotic schizophrenic construct. We also know that there's importantly, there's many non-diagnostic groups of people that hear voices. So from a spiritual perspective, people hear voices. It's not unusual. I think it's worth saying that my stepfather, who's a wonderful man, preaches in the very church where I was abused, which is just coincidental, really. But when he was an administrator in the government in London, heard God come to his office and tell him he ought to ordain as a priest. So that's not a voice anyone particularly worries about, although he did give up his job, a well-paid job, and have 5 kids at home while he was unemployed to train as a priest. So if you contextualize that in the schizophrenic scene, that's a person making unwise decisions and choices. And I'm not wanting to pass judgment on spirituality. I'm just saying to him, the premonition, voice and presence of God was profound and wonderful and changed his life in a beautiful way. There's sleep-related and stress-related are very common experiences. And Jim Van Oss's work, who's a psychiatrist and epidemiologist in Europe, he's done some incredible work around young people and voices, particularly giving us this sort of some data around about 30% of people between 14 and 25 will have an experience that could be related to a psychotic symptom. But about 80% of those people will move through life without any support around it and cease to have those experiences. So I'm just trying to give you a real kind of depth of where our work's coming from. There's also history around voices, things like philosophy, again, spirituality. We can think about the process of witches and what we meant by that. I'm not sure whether the witches were psychotic or the people that thought they were witches, but certainly history has a pretty poor journey in terms of how we lay labels on people in that regard. So if we move then to a kind of traumagenic, and the model that this refers to is a traumagenic neurodevelopmental model, and that's the two pictures of the brain I was showing you about, the two narratives of the traumatized brain and the schizophrenic brain. What they're talking about is a kind of traumagenic versus illness model. So how do we kind of understand that? And I've just included a few studies here. There's many, but these are studies that I think have been influential. So Lang's, R.D. Lang's book, which wasn't, well, he called it a study, but The Divided Self, which was a kind of classic text in the time and really summarized a lot of important work, whether you agree with it or not. It was certainly an interesting conceptual framework. Janssen's study in 2004 around psychosis was a dreadful study, but it kind of blew open the market, if you like, for me, that we could now start talking about the prevalence of trauma and psychosis. If you ever go and read that study, it's not really a very solid piece of evidence, but it was something that came before a lot of other studies. And Corsten and Rom's work in 2008 was the Hearing Voices work. Varèse's work in 2012 coined the term dose response between trauma and psychosis. And he said that if you have two types of adversity in your life, you're 5 times more likely to get diagnosed with psychosis. If you have 3 times, you're 30 times more likely to get diagnosed with psychosis. So he said there was this dose response between the experiences of childhood trauma and adversity and the likelihood of being told you're psychotic. Reed's model. And then in 2018, Bailey and colleagues said that childhood trauma is a risk factor for development of psychosis. And where we've moved since then is saying that actually it's probably dissociation in the context of trauma that is a better predictor of psychosis. And that fits with this idea that voices and psychosis is more easily understood as dissociative than biogenetically conditioned. I hope this is making sense. It's my subject and I know I can rattle on. Just to give you a couple of sort of modern things that are happening in this field, this paper on the right, which is about psychosis and schizophrenia, came out of the British Psychological Society clinical division when they wanted to start including clinicians, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, nurses, mostly, and then people with a lived experience as well. And this was a very powerful document. It's free on the BPS website, sort of explaining why people sometimes have these unusual experiences. And then, of course, most of you, I'm sure, will have come across the Power Threat Meaning Framework, which again came out of the British Psychological Society clinical condition and was developed as an alternative to the DSM. When the DSM-5 came out, the British Psychological Society put out a statement saying this is not scientific. As a scientific institution, we can no longer go along with it. And then when they did that, there was a necessity then for them to propose some alternative. And the Power Threat Meaning Framework is a conceptual alternative to understand power and the experience of negative operation of power in people's lives and how they respond. One way they can respond is to be psychotic, and that creates something different in their environment. So thinking about how we work then with psychosis and voices, I guess is important. And if anyone's ever heard me before, you'll know that I'm a R.D. Lang fan, and my supervisors since I trained in 2001 were colleagues and friends of Lang. Indeed, one of them lived in Kingsley Hall as a trainee psychotherapist. She left the convent where she was a nun to go and train with Lang, and she was my supervisor. But I really think this is the kind of start of what I want to tell you about working with people with these experiences. That the therapist and the therapist in the broadest sense of the word must have the plasticity to transpose himself into another strange and even alien view of the world. In this act, he draws on his own psychotic possibilities without foregoing his sanity. Only thus can he arrive at the understanding of the patient's existential position. Very wordy, but a very important concept then, that it's beginning this conversation that any one of us could have these unusual realities given the environment and the conditions that they were important and necessary. So I suppose my work really in Sociocratic builds on that. I'm just going to jump through a little bit. Okay, so that's the kind of setup. So what I want to say then is how do we work with psychosis? How do we work with voices? Well, there's 1,000,001 fantastical models, you know, from CBT to psychoanalysis to everything in between, positive psychology, psychosocial interventions. This is an individualized model, really, to think about going to the person and asking them what it is they need and how they need to be worked with. But of course, the old language is that these people are mad or psychotic or crazy. So we don't trust in their ability to be able to communicate to us how best they would like to be treated. And by treated, I really mean how best they'd like to be in human relationship. So we wrote this paper, the Sociocratic, Seeing the Non-Psychosis We Share. And really what we're aiming to do, and I'll go through this in a moment, what we're aiming to do then is develop a sort of coexisting same experience, we call it, which is a shared human interconnectedness with right understanding of one another's positions. Not that the psychotic person is wrong and needs to change, or the non-psychotic person is wrong and needs to change, but can we be in the relationship and accept we have different experiences of the same moment? Finding love, meaning and safety towards the existential imperative of that shared non-psychosis. And the paper, if you ever care to read it, talks about the evaporation of psychosis when there's safety in human-to-human relationship. And this draws on models of Viktor Frankl's work, Joyce Travelby's work, Gertrude Schwing's work, as well as Lang, the Power Threat Meaning Framework, some Freud even, dare I say. So there's a kind of plethora of bringing of theories brought together in this model. One of the things that I would talk about from a lived experience, but also I've seen professionally, is this idea of liminality. And liminality as a theory. One of the components of liminality is that people get lost betwixt and between the structures of society. So they no longer are able to be labelled within the norms of our societal structures. And I think psychotic people fit well into that. They sit outside what is accepted as normal by the definition of psychosis. They're often threshold people, or liminal personae is the language. And really important to me, they're temporarily stripped of worldly status and privilege. And of course, that is what happens if someone expresses psychosis in the wrong way. We have mental health acts, we have institutions and pillars of authority that decide the threshold where a person needs to have their civil and human rights taken away from them. I realise this is a controversial subject, but I think it's okay that we explore these things as society and community. One of the things we see in liminality then is people become ritualistic and creative. And the dangers in that for psychotic people is that if you become ritualistic and creative and people already think you're psychotic, they think you're even madder. So I would say this is akin to the sort of double bind theory, where there is no way a person can get out of the situation they're in. So developing right understanding is really important, and for the therapist it's important to accept that the reality is what is in this moment will always change. So how do we modulate ourselves as practitioners rather than asking the person in distress to change? And I think that's a really important thing to consider. And what we're aiming for in this model is to do away with goals. In my career in private practice, I've only ever one single time been asked by someone to develop a care plan. When I worked in the public mental health system, I had to make care plans for everyone every 3 months. And broadly speaking, the people I was working with were not interested. So how do we do away with goals in a trusting process that if we're moving together, we'll get to where we need to get to? And that's part of this concept. So I'll talk a little bit now just about the sociocratic, because I think that's probably quite an important thing to explain, because I think it sums up what I've said. But I just want to give you this quote, and this was from a book in 1954. So I think it's interesting to contrast and compare where we are now and where we've been when we think of what is, I mean, my work in South Australia has been called radical, dangerous, all those odd labels. I take an awful lot of care, and I have great intention in supporting people to find the right path for them. So it might sound that I'm anti this or anti that, but actually half the people that come to my clinic take medication, and I support them to do that. most of them want to maintain their labels for a period of time, their diagnostic labels. And I think that's their right, and that's great. I think what we have to be open to is that over time, people might want to change the way they're described and the treatment they accept as reasonable. And so I think, but in 1954, Gertrude Schwing, who was a nurse who worked with Frieda Reichmann, she said, force or restraint became immediately unnecessary for all patients with whom I was able to establish a relationship. This always happened with impressive rapidity. Second of all, these experiences became accessible for further psychotherapy. And if you read the book A Journey to the Soul of the Mentally Ill by Gertrude Schwing, written originally in 1939, before the Second World War in Europe, where she was, what she used to do was go and sit with a person long enough until they chose to come back into relationship. And it was at that point she would say that the restraint and control of people was just not necessary. So I think that's a really great spirit to think of this work in, really. How do we stay and focus on being in relationship? So the sociocratic experience, then I made up this word one day, having spent some time in a psychiatric room with a client who I knew, who came to our Hearing Voices group, got himself admitted to our hospital because he wanted to work with me, and he couldn't see me in the community because he didn't fit into my postcode. As is the health service model, you have to live in the right place to get the right treatments. So he got himself to the hospital that I had rights attached to, and I had a phone call on the Monday morning saying, oh, this guy's got admitted and he only wants to work with you. Can you come and see him? So I went and hung out with him, and he was telling me about these very distressing voices that were violent and abusive. And the psychiatrist came and saw him, took him away from me and assessed him, and he told the psychiatrist the same thing. And the psychiatrist decided to detain him because they were telling him to kill me and stuff. And he got put in, he then got up and threw the table on the floor and got put in a seclusion cell. And 4 hours later, they sent me away. And 4 hours later, they rang me up and said, oh, you couldn't come back and talk to him because you won't talk to us. So I went in with a friend of mine, and we asked the security to stay outside, and we talked. And I said to him, Mitch, when your voices are telling you to kill me, do you want to hurt me, or is it just your voices? And as I said this, a tear rolled down his cheek. And we sat for a while, and I said, oh, what do you want to happen now? And he said, can we have a hug? So the three of us stood up in this seclusion cell and hugged, and he wept and he wept and he wept. And, you know, the journey played out. And 6 months later, I saw him in a supermarket, and he said to me, you know, Matt, when we were hugging that day and I was crying, I couldn't hear any voices. And it just struck me that we need to be brave, and we need to be strong and change the language and the way we perceive people, because otherwise we miss these opportunities for human connection and for healing in different ways through people's lives. So I thought, okay, what I need to do is come up with a word. And if we think of psychosis as dissociative rather than biological, but it's not like normal dissociation, which we often think of as passive and shutting down. It's more like a busy, active process. Okay, we'll take cotic from psychotic, which means that kind of busy, active process. Dissociare from dissociation. Brilliant. I'll make up this word. And 4 years later, it's published in peer-reviewed journals and academic textbooks, and it feels a bit surreal. But the theory that I've sort of wrapped around it then, dissociotic is the experience of animation and giving life to being at variance of companionship to self. So separating ourselves off from our own experience, dissociatively, for the survival in self in relationship to the interpersonal threat from the other. So we do that to set ourselves at variance from threats of other people. And if you know the origins of the word dissociation and dissociare, it means just that. It means to set yourself at variance and companionship from others when there's threat. We now use it as a psychological term, but it used to mean a more physical sense of separating yourself off. So this is where the word came from. And I'll just explain it so we can understand then that psychosis is I'm assuming you're all with me. We can understand that psychosis then is a dissociative phenomena. It's a change in primary consciousness when we need to change consciousness to survive. And the way then we work with this is that the person on the right experiences voices, visions, other psychosis, and they put that between themselves and me on the left so that they can survive. So they put psychosis there. So then what I have to be in relationship with is not the person, but their expression and their psychosis in their altered state of dissociotic. And within that, I'm suggesting that that happens because the trauma in their life, the meaning they've made from that, and the representation in this moment makes them dissociate in this way. And we see it as psychosis, but actually they're having a sort of change of conscious state as a function of survival. I'm mindful of my time, so I'm going to jump on through just to give a kind of another nod to Lang. If you want to understand this from a theoretical perspective, in The Divided Self, he talked about ontological insecurity. And ontological insecurity is this insecurity of being. It's something we all share. My theory in this model is we can't bear the thought that we might be the psychotic person, so we try to stop them with medication, with hospitalization, by shutting them down. And we've built a theory of biological illness around that, because that serves for those of us that aren't psychotic. But ontological security is in all of us. We all experience a sense of fear of being in one sense or another. So then Lang talked about nihilism taking over when we were in deep ontological insecurity. And this is where we have this kind of disconnection from life and living and other beings when we cease to exist. So that's the kind of theory behind this. So I'm just going to explain it with some silly diagrams. My wonderful daughter did these for me because I'm not very good with technology. But just to kind of clarify what I'm saying then, dissociation we've traditionally thought of as a shut down, flattening out affect. And it's a very primitive brain response. So if we think of it, when animals roamed the earth and humans were on the earth, we needed to kill the animals to survive for various reasons. They needed to chase us. There's a bit of poetic license required. They needed to chase their prey. So we would fight them as the normal fight response. We'd run away from them, or we'd freeze. But if those things didn't work in the fight, flight, freeze, we'd go to dissociation, playing dead. And the animal, and this is the poetic license that's required, the animal, of course, would want to chase its prey, so it would run past us and we'd survive. So that was with an old school brain and a passive dissociation. What I'm suggesting is we've adapted to a new threat. The threat's no longer an animal, it's a person. The brain has developed to a much more nuanced way of understanding experiences. So we might fight it, we might run away, we might freeze. All of those leave us as sitting ducks from the threatening people in our lives or society. If we play dead as we used to, and this is where the brain, I'm hypothesizing, it's a hypothesis, I don't know, I'm not a neuroscientist of any form. If we play dead, the person doesn't run past us, the person comes and does resuscitation and keeps us alive. So that no longer keeps us safe. So we created a psychotic expression, because if you stand in the street shouting at your voices, people move away from you, much like the animal would run past you when you were flat and laid out. So that's the kind of theory here. What does that mean for treatment? Well, we need to shift the idea of treatment being focused on the individual having to change, and shift it to the therapist taking responsibility and care of the environment. We need to be able to attune to and be available to our own sense of being in the moment. What are we doing in any given moment that feeds the other person's sense of fear and threat, that's going to split them off and make them seem more psychotic? And are we impeding their opportunity for safety? So that's that. We might notice what the threat was. How does that change in the moment? How does that change in their life? What is the threat that they're talking about in living, and how could we be in a different way with them so that they don't feel that threat in the same way? And just a very quick example, a young woman came to see me, been in the psychiatric system a while, not currently hearing voices. She's an Ayurvedic practitioner, believes in ahimsa, non-violence, very, very gentle soul. And I crossed my legs, we're talking normally, and I crossed my legs over and put one foot on top of the other. And very, very quickly, she started weeping and putting her hands over her ears. And I asked her what was happening. She said, the voices are telling me you might hurt me. And I said, oh, and it was very, very strange that it sort of emerged so quickly. And eventually I said, oh, is there something I've done? Did I do something that happened? And she looked down at my feet, and I said, oh, is it when I crossed my legs? And she said, yeah, the voices are telling me if you're willing to hurt one foot with the other foot, then you're probably willing to attack me. And so I said, oh, would you like me to undo my legs? Would you like me to take my foot off my leg? And she said, I really would. And that kind of threat response dried up. and her tears dried up, and she no longer was overwhelmed with voices and distressed. So you can make what you want of that, but that's what happened. It was a very interesting experience for me to see that my behavior was what was creating the need for a change in consciousness. So then, rather than once we see that people are calm, suddenly going towards them, we need to hold back longer and facilitate the person coming towards us. If we have most of the people I see have a chronic label of schizophrenia, long-term psychiatric care, there's no great rush. Some of the great therapists who've worked with schizophrenia, Bertram Caron for one, would see people for vast periods of time, because a lot of it was allowing people to coming back into relation, staying still until the person comes back into relationship with you, and really giving that time. If you go towards people, you're going to push people back into that liminal, fearful space, and you'd really expect to see more voices in psychosis, I'd argue. So just a little visual showing you that I'm still sitting still and the person's walking towards me. They're walking towards me when the trauma dissociation meaning is less invasive. At that point, we might start sharing the different and same realities, or a coexisting same experience, facilitating just a moment when the threat might not exist. We might not even name it, but we might both be aware of it. You might begin to name it, and the person's no longer feeling so liminal. The story can emerge. We can start to come together, and then we're going to be with the person in this experience, really exploring the different and unique realities. And this is where I would say the psychosis evaporates in the context of human to human connectedness. And I am running a bit fast, so I'm nearly finished. And what's the point of this? Well, the point of this is then getting to this deep connection. A shared experience of human-human interconnectedness emerges with right understanding. And most importantly, it's this point that we can start to hear the authorship or the re-authorship of a person's story. And up until this point, we've had to make up what's going on and how to change things. So this model and our way of working with psychosis and voices is very much about creating the conditions in the environment so people's voices and visions don't need to be present, and then they can author their story. And a much more traditional psychotherapy approach occurs then, although I would argue my approach is fairly traditional. So just to summarize, to look and to listen to a person and see signs of schizophrenia as a disease, and to look and to listen to see him simply as a human being, are to see and to hear in a radically different way. So this is about us as the supporter, the worker, the therapist, the family member, the friend, the person in the street, rather than asking the other person to do all the changing. We're the ones that are said to be in our right mind, able to control ourselves, so we can take that responsibility on. Just 2 slides. Be creative and be open. I can't stress that enough. When we get into models and structures around psychosis, we shorten the amount of time we want to spend with people, and we ask people to fit and conform into our models. And I know the work that's been going on in New Zealand is giving a lot of potential for change and a breadth of change that in Australia we could only dream of. Our Royal Commission in Victoria, the terms of reference were so ridiculously narrow that we weren't ever going to actually discuss things that people with lived experience wanted to discuss. Whereas I think your opportunity seems much broader and more realistic in terms of change, which from over the sea seems quite hopeful and exciting, really. But just thinking then is, sitting quietly as a therapy, not going to goals, allowing people to go at their own space, just listening and offering justice to people's stories is in of itself a therapeutic intervention and extremely powerful. And so, as I said, I'll send the slides out, but thinking about metaphor and meaning, how can we use metaphor and meaning, both of the presentation of psychosis and voices? What do they mean? What are they trying to tell us? Thinking about the human relationship and the willingness of the professional to be honest and integrity to themselves. Thinking this is an emotional response, an experiential response, and how we can coexist as we share these as humans, rather than needing to use labels. And then really ensuring that from a cultural perspective, and whatever culture anyone is, how can people tell a story from a cultural perspective that makes sense to them? And I would just give you an example of that. When I was 13 years old, I had my first psychotic experience in a classroom in school. An enormous object came through the wall, a kind of omnipotent object to kill me, and I hid under the table, and everyone caught on fire. Well, this is what I thought. And this was 30 years ago. and I was screaming to stop this happening. And they, the head teacher came and took me out of the classroom and sat me in a sick room for the day. And then at the end of the day, I was just allowed to go home. And no one ever knew about this except the people in the room. And I suppose years later, I would say that that happened around the time I was escaping from the church that I'd been in. And perhaps had my community had the courage to sit with me and listen to and find out the story behind it, it would have been useful to the whole community. And this is what I mean about the presence of psychosis and voices offering messages that we need to know for healing for the whole community, rather than focusing on the individual change. That's what I wanted to share with you.
Hey, Matt, that was fantastic. And I guess there's been a few questions come through, and I just wanted to follow up on that. But I thank you very much for sharing your experience, because that's profound. One of our people, Ruth, asked about what are your thoughts around the open dialogue approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think open dialogue has been a game changer in the places where it's implemented with a fidelity to the model. I think what it does is it's a sort of network process of what I've described. What you find in open dialogue, for those that don't know, and we do some open dialogue informed work here, is that people come in with their loved one in the network saying this person's got a problem, and they leave realizing that everybody in the network's got a problem. And so that's, for me, very similar to this process of taking the pressure off the person to change and say, oh, all of us have the opportunity to choose how we act from here. So I think open dialogue looks costly and expensive. And I think if you look at the origins of the model in Western Lapland, they invested in it and now they have the benefits. So they've reduced their hospital beds from 384 to 64 or something like that. But it's taken a long time. And this is what I think you've got the opportunity for, is cultural change, right?
Yeah, totally. I know you and I have been talking for a wee while about how do we bring your training and your methodology and
yes.
even the Just Listening program to New Zealand.
Yeah.
And a few people have asked, how do we bring this stuff to New Zealand and get it part of the overall set of options we offer people? Have you been thinking anything more about what would be the ideal way for that?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think there's an open dialogue is a good example. This is about submerging yourself in this work. I don't think it's a dip your toe in the water type work. Either you say, we're going to take on an approach, the whole team's going to take it on, from psychiatrist to peer worker to OT to families to individual. This is a whole community model. And it can be different. It'll look different in different communities. It'll look culturally different in different places. But you have to submerge yourself in the belief that we can find out together rather than having experts of hypothesis. And I think there's training and then there's practice, but I think there's a shift somewhere about, can we let go of the risk narratives? This might sound risky to people. We don't do risk assessments at Humane Clinic because risk assessments have been demonstrated for the most part not to predict outcomes. What they do is they give a narrative for professionals to put plans in place. That doesn't necessarily give an outcome. So one of the things we've done is done away with risk assessment, but we supervise our staff. So in the Just Listening community, you do a 3-hour shift, you have half an hour supervision at the start and half an hour at the end, and you use the same model that we offer the public in those half an hour before and afters. So, and that's very similar to open dialogue. Only one model and everybody experiences the same for all professionals. So me as the director of the clinic, I get the same support as the person that walks in off the street. And so that's how I think we implement these models, is say there is no great difference between what happens in the bureaucratic office to the clinician's office to the person's life at home.
Yeah.
We're common humans.
Yeah. And how do you see the Just Listening approach and medication? Because that seems to be a stigma for some people.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I think, as I said, I think the question for me is how do we defer to the person having power over their choices in medication? And there's great precedents for this. Professor Joanna Moncrief, psychiatrist in England, talks very openly about talking more honestly about medication, that we're giving medication to change people's states of consciousness so we can include them in that. We're not giving them the medication to treat a disease, because that's not actually really good evidence. And I think that in just listening, if you have a same model across the service, you just go, if someone comes to just listening and wants to talk about medication, we give justice to their narrative of medication. You know, I work with someone at the moment who's on 8 psychotropic drugs in the mental health team. It's a barbaric abuse of a human, right? But probably if I use language like barbaric abuse of a human, it's not that useful to that person. So again, it's about going back to the model, and I'll take responsibility for my stuff and listen deeply to her, and then we collaborate on what comes out of that. And actually what she really wants is, she doesn't want to come off all those meds. She wants to rationalize the 3 antipsychotics she's on, and the 2 benzos and the 2 antidepressants. So really she just wants to get back to something that feels for her reasonable for her living. So I really think it's about that justice, that deep listening, and that willingness to take responsibility for our own part in hearing the story, and then we can move forward together. Yeah.
Sure. Everyone. We're going to send out Matt's slides in the next few days, and Matt and I are committed to seeing how we can bring this approach to New Zealand. We're working with a good friend of ours, Anna Elders, who's a nurse practitioner over here and a CBT practitioner. And we're also talking to a couple of kaupapa Māori organisations to host it within a kaupapa Māori environment as well. Because for many who hear voices, it's actually perceived as a blessing in this community. So that's kind of a neat thing. Matt, I really want to thank you for your message, for what you've brought today. I wish you the very best, and you'll be able to see in the chat just how many people are delighted with your presentation and your spirit and heart. Go well, my good friend.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll speak to you
Kia ora.
soon.
Kia ora, everyone. You keep yourselves safe, and do keep on doing the wonderful work you're doing. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you.
Kia ora.